All right, welcome everyone to the July 15th Arborist call. Looking forward to catching everyone up on NE5, and I wanted to have a discussion around zips, which we'll talk about kind of the zip process and living specifications, but we'll talk about that more in a moment. Meeting format is we have a brief welcome and intro. We provide research and implementation updates on the nodes, Zcashd and Zcashd. And those are optional. If we've got something specific to call out about those two implementations, we do that. Otherwise, we just hop right into the discussions. Today, we're going to be providing, obviously, a big topic is NU5 and our progress on that. So an NU5 update on the just general status, audit update, and then kind of overall timeline. We always take a look at that based on the latest. And then the additional topic that was suggested for today was that we spend some time talking about how we might be able to improve the zip process or zip format to better distinguish and handle living specifications. There's actually some examples in NU5 of what we would consider living specifications. So just kind of wanted to talk about that, get everyone's ideas and thoughts on how to best handle those type zips. And then we just, throughout, I encourage any questions or comments or anything, but, if there's anything at the end we need to circle back on or just any kind of announcements, we do that too. Briefly, if you're not familiar with Arborist calls, they're where protocol developers, contributors, and folks interested in protocol development get together to talk about upgrade timelines like we'll do today, the process of producing network upgrades, current R&D efforts, design, implementation. So any and all things protocol related is up for discussion. The purpose is to make it, one, more transparent, so the community at large has insights into what's going on the protocol side and how we're progressing. But it's open, it's to encourage and make it easier for people to plug in and contribute as well. Anybody can participate in the calls. As I've said before, you're welcome to sign up and present. We had Ziggurat presenting last time. If there's something that you want to talk about, but you don't necessarily want to present it yourself, just let me know. We'll slot it in, and this is definitely the right call to have people just kind of discuss it, if nothing else, kind of in an open format. So anyway, my email's there, steven@electriccoin.co. Reach out and let me know that you'd like to either present something or have a future topic added to the agenda. So okay, so research and implementation status updates. Anyone on the Zcashd side, any update this week on progress there?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So we're making good progress towards validation of NU5 and previous network upgrades. We are parsing the new message WTX, so the wide transaction format for non-malleable transaction IDs, but we're just ignoring it until we have a mempool. We fixed a Zcash bug because how to Zcash Coinbase transactions wasn't really in the spec. And so that let us finish off our Zcash and spend off verification for NU5. So that's again, Orchard and non-malleable transaction IDs. We started rejecting double spends for shielded and transparent. Turns out that's really complicated to test because there are a lot of shielded pools, and there's a lot of ways, at least in Rust, that you can accidentally put your nullifiers in a hash set and remove duplicates. And we want to make sure we don't accidentally do that at some point. And we also got rid of a bunch of unimplemented statements that were going to make us panic at NU5 activation. So we're pretty sure that Zebra will keep on running after NU5 activates. We're still waiting for the NU5 testnet activation height, and we're still looking for the delivery of the Orchard circuit, the tagging of releases for shared dependencies, and a spec for transaction lock time validation. And we're basically interested in what date we'll have those so that we can plan for those. So I don't know if anybody from the ECC can help with that.
But thank you
for
for
sure.
opening Thank you for opening the tickets on Zcash zips. I'm just looking at those now. Yeah, we can clarify the spec for those. Does someone else want to answer the other questions?
Our intent with the orchard circuit, which I believe is what we refer to as the action circuit, it's kind of the main circuit. We have a couple dependencies that we merged this week that we needed to get in place for that, and our goal is to have that code complete within a couple of days, and then of course we've got some pretty stringent review cycles. So we'll have that complete in the next couple of days, and then we'll be going through rounds of internal reviews for a few days after that. So we hope to have it, let's just say sometime next week, hopefully by midweek would be our goal on the orchard or action circuit, whichever one you'd like to call it. Strad, is Strad on the call?
Yep.
Yeah, and you probably are in best position to answer the question about dependencies and the crates there.
Yeah, we haven't made any progress in terms of additional tagging of things in the last couple of weeks because we've been solely focused on the consensus pieces to get the action circuit ready. I don't think anything has materially changed though in terms of what is taggable since we last spoke. The orchard crate is obviously, making progress towards containing the full action circuit. And as far as everything else that goes into it, it's pretty stable in terms of changes now. There's a few more small changes to certain APIs that need to happen. And I think there's a couple of refactors that we've got in place for just changing where like the zip 244 stuff goes and so on. And then obviously we have anything that comes up in the last stages of the, both audits. So we'll get to that in a bit, but the...
So speaking of things that came up, there's the inclusion of the HRP in the redundancy for unified addresses. So basically that's so that you can't just malleate the HRP and keep the rest of the address the same. So that is a spec change that will require test vector changes. But the change to the spec is really minor. That's in a PR on Zcash zips at the moment. But review of that would be good.
Yeah, so it's the sort of thing that's like
that's out of scope for us right now.
Okay. And it's also
we don't have client.
I see.
Right.
Yeah, and it's technically, if we didn't make that change, we'd be no worse off than for Sapling, because right now for Sapling it's the same. It's just because that's the way that Bitcoin designed Bec32. But we have the opportunity to fix it so that then if you have a fork of Zcash address getting used in Zcash, it actually does look different rather than all the same bar a couple of characters at the end. So worth taking the opportunity to do that. I'm
guessing you won't be in a position to tag those shared dependencies, at least the orchard crate, until the end of next week at the earliest.
At the very earliest. And let me think about that. We can't tag anything until the action circuit's done. And then the action circuit obviously is then still going through audit. So there may be changes that get made post that. If it would help you, we could potentially tag a pre-release version for you to depend on rather than depending on a commit hash, if you would like that.
That would be very helpful once things are done, and particularly once the external API is stable. We'd love a pre-release.
Yeah, the external API has been stable for a while now, as far as like circuit verification goes, and actually pretty much all of the orchard crate is pretty stable. All of the APIs for making proofs, for example, were stabilized, a month or two ago. All that we're changing in these PRs is the internals of how they work. So if you wanted to, you could start playing with them now. Right now, what's in the orchard crate right now is a dummy circuit that does nothing, but like is good for the purpose it's built for, which is just to make things keep going.
Yeah, we might start doing that next week. We've been prioritizing things that change Zebra's state because they tend to be more complex changes. So we wanted to get them in first.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Yep, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whereas this is just, does this pass?
Yeah. Did that cover everything, Taylor, that you mentioned, or was there something that we didn't?
So the other thing that we're waiting on is the NU5 test activation date, because once we have the date or the block height, that's the point at which we make some minor changes to the code, enable some tests that are waiting on actually having an activation height, and also update our DNS seeders. With
Right, because you don't have
version.
you don't have like an equivalent of a red test mode, do you?
No, not yet. Yeah. It was one of the things that we put out of scope once we cut scope to get Zebra done.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
All right. Yeah, we'll talk about schedule in a minute, which
Great.
you know, it won't give you the height, but it'll give you some insights anyway. So
no, that's totally fine. We're just looking for
right.
A more specific indication on the dates. That's all.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. Updates on the Zcashd side. That's kind of what we're about to talk about just in general with NU5. So I'll just hop into that. Everything we would talk about with Zcashd is all related to NU5.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything in particular that I can think of, other than I will give a shout out to some lovely community members who left some very nice review on one of my open backporting PRs, Zcash, and I am going to completely mispronounce the name unless I look it up.
Ajaxis, I think.
Let me pull it up. Zcash and Aloara V. I pronounced that really wrong as well, but they went and left a review on one of our PRs, and I'm very grateful for it. Thank you very much. It does absolutely help us get things like that in that aren't currently on our critical path in more easily. So thank you.
Right. Yep. Yeah, we're going to call that out in the community update tomorrow as well. But yeah, no, greatly appreciated. Okay, moving on to NU5, that's the the feature set. This is the same list of zips that we've chatted about. Obviously, over time, we've added to the list. Several of these are updated, so they were existing zips that we added. Let's just call it generically orchard-specific information to. So these are denoted as updated everywhere, and then the other zips that are not denoted updated are net new zips for NU5 specifically. So that's the list. Shouldn't be a surprise to anyone there. On the audit schedule, here's kind of where we're at. Kedit and NCC are in the implementation. And then, by the way, this is kind of the implementation audit side of things. Spec audit started way back. NCC actually kind of wrapped up this week. They sent us a draft report on the 13th. So the two bullets on each one that are in bold are date modifications from the last time I presented this. But we got the draft report on the 13th. They'll be working on the final. I don't have a date for that yet, but I don't believe we'll take them more than a couple of weeks for that. On the Kedit side, the Kedit report, we were looking to have a final report on the 15th of July. They it kind of worked out very well for us anyway. They asked if we could shift their final 2 weeks of work to the latter half of July on the implementation audit, which actually worked out incredibly well for us because we were already redlining on getting things ready, and it gave us a little bit of breathing room. So at any rate, that's the updated audit schedule. Kedit will wrap up on July 29th, so essentially 2 weeks from today. Okay, questions about any of that before I move on to the schedule? It's reflected in the updated kind of timeline as well. Okay. In terms of timeline, I'm going to minimize a window here so I can see a little better. Yeah, so in terms of timeline, as I mentioned, the NCC implementation audit wrapped up on the 13th. The draft, we have the draft report anyway. So nothing net new will change, just some typos in there. And we have a chance to review it, of course. The Kedit implementation audit will wrap up on the 29th, which is right here. We are in the last Arborist call we had a testnet activation window kind of latter half of July. We want to get everything out of this audit. This is kind of probably the most critical 2 weeks of the audit effort. Not that the rest of it hasn't been incredibly valuable, but they're going to be looking specifically at the circuit, the action circuit, and the components that comprise that. So once we get their final report, everything they found, we have it addressed, then we can look at cutting a testnet release. So I kind of just pop the window over to the first part of August for that. That will give us time to get their report 2 weeks from today. And then if there's anything that we don't know about already, we'll have an interim findings from their work next week. And if there's anything net new on the 29th, that'll give us some time to just kind of roll that in, cut a testnet release, pick a height. So 2 weeks from today, we would, Taylor, we would be in pretty good shape to probably pick an activation height or tell you when we could potentially pick an activation height, depending on what we learn from the audits and the other work that we have in flight. So that's kind of what we're looking at. I did not shift the target kind of activation window for mainnet. That's still kind of second half of July. The reason for doing so is we would October, sorry. Yeah, July, that would be aggressive. And in reverse. But yes, in October. I mean, we would love to still hit an activation for mainnet target in the second half of October for a variety of reasons. Obviously, the goal of testnet is to test the node implementations, make sure they're squared away, they're behaving like we believe they should behave, to the best of our ability to test, and also work with partners to make sure that they're ready for mainnet activation as well. So, mainnet activations are always to be determined based on how well the testnet deployment period goes. But that is still our goal. We'd love to activate the second half of October. We would just like to get that wrapped up well ahead of, holidays and people beginning to take time off and things of that nature. We don't want to get in any kind of crunch, honestly, in the month of November with it. Now, having said that, I'll kind of repeat it again. Depending on how well testnet goes, how well we're progressing with the remaining development items that are not consensus critical, how well we progress with the wallet SDKs that we're building, the reference apps that we're building, how well we progress with the partners that we're working with will kind of determine when it makes sense to activate NU5 on mainnet. But that's our target. Taylor, did you raise a hand? I thought I saw that little pop-up coming there.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that there are a few factors that make the testnet deployment and testing perhaps a bit more complex than previous network upgrades. So we've got the Orchard change, which is a new shielded pool. We've got the change to unified addresses. We've got the change to non-malleable transaction IDs. And we also have 2 node implementations starting to validate. Mm-hmm. So that feels like a significant amount of test complexity budget. So I guess we had a question coming out of that this week. How are we going to handle any testnet fixes and coordinate those between the 2 nodes?
Do you mean testnet fixes in terms of if there is a problem that requires changes to what's deployed on testnet, or do you mean in terms of testing to ensure, do you mean the testing process or remediation?
I mean remediation mainly. Yeah. But yes, it would be good to also coordinate the testing process if someone is going to do something unusual, like say hit the maximum size of a transaction or something in Orchard. We'd really like to know. So, well, no, I think those are really good tests to do on testnet. But yeah, please do let us know in the testing channel so we know how to diagnose node failures if those happen.
Yeah. As far as remediation goes, so we have had to do remediations before to testnet, most notably when we had to regenerate the sapling parameters. We had them all. We had the dummy parameters. Not dummy. We had the smaller participant parameters that we deployed to testnet, and then we ran the main protocol, and we had to roll back testnet to be able to switch to the final parameters. So we have had to do remediations of that sort before. Zcashd is that we were able to, like, from our side, what we would do is say, okay, we know that we need to effectively change the activation point of NU5 on testnet. So we would say the old one is no longer valid. We re-pick the activation height on testnet, which would include any changes, any remediations, and that would effectively change the consensus branch ID for NU5, both on testnet and mainnet. And then Zcashd will just rewind to that point and then keep going forwards. So my understanding of Zebra's architecture, you would probably want to just drop your database and start again, I would pick.
So we actually merged that change, about a week or two ago now. So what happens is that we check the consensus branch ID on startup, and if it doesn't match if the consensus branch ID in the database doesn't match what's configured in the code, then yes, Zebra will panic and tell the user they should delete the database. So we weren't going to be automatically deleting databases because there's the risk of, say, opening an old branch and deleting a new database. But yes, we will be warning the user that, our strategy is just to restart from the start because
you're fast enough.
Let's just say it was simpler at the time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it definitely was tricky to get this piece right in Zcashd, the rollback logic. We're effectively doing a thing where at each activation height on disk, we log at the time what the consensus branch ID was, and then we do I forget if it's forwards or backwards scan over the entire chain on startup to make sure that all of the steps, all the activation boundaries on disk line up with what we expect for the code implementation.
Yeah.
And then we use that to figure out the point at which the two have their first mismatch, and we roll back to that point.
Yeah, so because NU5 sticks the consensus branch ID in transactions, we can just literally look at the last 100 blocks.
Yeah, which makes it far easier.
Yep. And we do all our rollback in memory too. All our sort of chain fault rollback.
Yeah.
Strad, I thought we had to, so for example, when we rolled back testnet for sapling, we designed this anticipated rollback thing that allows us to roll back more than 100 blocks.
That's exactly what I'm referring to.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's exactly what I've been describing.
So sorry, I didn't recognize the description, but yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So Taylor, to your, go ahead, Strad.
Yeah, so I think that's the way we would do remediation. So we would just coordinate on what the fixes are to testnet, and then we would coordinate on a new activation height and a new consensus branch ID, and then switch the nodes to do that. So there'd be a period where people would have two chains, but testnet's generally small enough that everyone would just roll.
But by the way, I noticed on this diagram the typo and implementation.
Oh man,
the implementation is still not fixed.
Are you kidding? You did. You absolutely did. And I took a note to do it and got busy.
Didn't you fix it in real time last time around, or was that a different typo?
That was a different typo. But I would do it, but then you'd see behind the scenes of like me editing a spreadsheet, pulling the spreadsheet into the tool to regenerate it. But I will get.
We'll let you off.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But I will get it fixed. So, all right. Taylor, did that kind of, how does that sound to you? Does that sound like a workable?
That sounds really good. I guess if there's anything that doesn't require a rollback, we can be a bit more flexible. But in the case that the rules get more permissive, we'd really like to know so that we don't accidentally stop validating blocks at some point.
Yeah. The way I treat this and the way that it was designed from Overwinter, all those many years ago, God, has it been that long, was that the consensus branch ID refers to a set of consensus rules. If those consensus rules change, the consensus branch ID must change. So even if it were something that we could technically do as a soft fork on testnet, I would prefer to roll it back, given it's testnet and we have the ability to do so.
That would also be fine with us. We would love to test that code on testnet.
Right. Marshall, I know Marshall's on the call. Is that, I mean, if that's like an edge case you wanted to test, is that something that could be tested? You could test that with testnet in a box, right?
Oh yeah, are you talking about the comment in the chat?
Oh, I didn't see the chat.
Oh, I was just Strad was talking about remediation. It's kind of in the
Oh,
same
right,
little
yeah.
bubble, but we did have that blip with someone. I don't know if it was ASIC specifically, but a large mining pool came on and then went off quick,
yeah.
and so we had to roll it back.
Oh, right.
So there's been a couple of
Yeah.
different scenarios of remediation after we had that 3-month testnet or 2-month testnet window.
Okay.
I don't think we actually rolled it back technically there because the network just halted, and then
I guess it did
changed the rules
technically
so that
halt.
it could continue.
So I guess, yeah. What was the
Alright,
other question, Steven? Sorry.
Oh, no. So if you wanted to specifically test like this remediation where you do a rollback, I think if I understood Taylor, he was saying that'd be great to test that at some point. You could
Mhm.
test that on testnet, a testnet in a box testnet as well, right?
Yep, depending on some
Yeah.
of the rollback scenarios you're doing, I think you can test most of them. There are a couple like nuances with some of the stuff that Strad was mentioning with branch IDs where it'll just reject it and think the chain's bad. And so you gotta do a couple
Okay.
of things, but there are a couple sanity checks. I wouldn't say it works for all of the corner cases, but
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that might be an option at some point, as well.
It's something we can discuss and play with once we're through consensus.
Yeah.
crunch.
Right.
I'm actually working on that
Yeah.
right now. That's one of my questions that came in the channel today. So when I get some progress on that, I can speak to that with a little bit more detail of something more
Okay.
close to master. So
All right. Sounds good.
Cool.
Okay. All right. Very good. Okay. Other questions, comments from anyone before we move on? All right. Thank you.
I've got one.
Oh, back up. Gotcha.
Is there any timeline for Mary Maher's security proof?
I mean, she did like some initial work early back in April, like the first part of April. We need to update the documents in the book essentially that we've given her for her to kind of, once we have everything finalized on the well, Halo 2 in particular, not so much the Orchard circuit, but for her to do kind of her final pass on. Sean, I think you said, I believe
We've
you
already
indicated.
We've already updated some of the documentation, but we're still
right. Yeah, we're not finished updating all the documentation. We've only just recently got to the point where we can actually freeze Halo
Right.
for audits. So yeah, we're almost there, but Mary's ready and waiting for us to send her the documents and do another pass through that. So
yeah, yep. So we would, I mean, we didn't even discuss it internally, other than I think Mary wasn't available this next week for some reason, but I would expect that's something that we would wrap up in the next few weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, we'd love to have that done before we activate on testnet, by the way. All right. Okay, moving on. This was a topic that had been suggested in the call planning channel in R&D. I think Strat, actually, you brought it up. If we, could add it to an agenda, Arborist agenda at some point. So you want to kind of introduce what you were thinking there and kind of open the discussion up?
Yeah. So we've had a bit of discussion over previous calls around just like change to spec and the way in which things have sort of been updated and clarified as the network upgrade process has gone on. And something that I think I noticed, and I think that sort of, become a bit more apparent as we've gone through this process this network upgrade cycle in particular, where we've had more teams sort of working with the documentation, is to do with knowing sort of where things are going and where, in terms of specification, and what things are expected to be updated versus things that are, yeah, sort of like where specifications live and by what process they end up changing, if at all. The original ZIP process, when we put it together, you know, Zcash improvement proposals, the idea was that they define a change to the network protocol. And so the idea effectively was that the Zcash protocol would be effectively a series, end up being a series of patches that, you know, collectively define the specification.
It was always the case that the protocol specification was supposed to be a living document.
Yes, there was a clear understanding for the protocol specification, but the zips, at least as I understood it, and I think as several understood it, was that it would be, you know, we want to make this change. Here's the proposal for making the change. Here's what the delta would be. Here's the motivation for making this change, and so on. And then once that's done, we know how to update the rules or make the change or implement the new payment address format or you know, request format or whatever.
So they'd be like a pull
over
request.
Pardon?
They'd be like a pull request.
Yeah, kind of. But now we have pull requests on pull requests, basically. And so how do we deal with that? So for example, zip32, we originally wrote it for sapling, where we defined an equivalent of BIP32 for doing HD hierarchical deterministic key trees from seeds. And when it came to define orchard, it's like, well, that is kind of where we've defined how all those trees live. We've never defined them in the protocol spec, so they have to go somewhere. Like, I guess they just go there. And then we kind of had the same thing with the rule that you know, the orchard pool must never go negative. We defined a zip to say we should enforce that on the network because there had never been a rule that enforced it prior to whatever zip it was that added it. And then it's like, well, we could just, we're adding the orchard pool in zip 224. So all of the rules related to orchard would logically go there. But then when you come to implement, it's like, well, actually it sort of bundles into the other ones. And so, yeah. So we ended up putting it in that zip.
Yeah. The other thing that changed was zip 212, which is defining how note encryption and decryption works. That also needed updating for orchard. So what we could have done is just update the protocol spec and leave zip 222 as it was. But I decided that it would be clearer for an implementer to be able to look at zip 212 and not see any contradictions with the spec. So it's a bit of a value judgment as to
so to sort of
far
lead
you
into
should
the
go
open
with
floor
things.
question a bit, the thing I'm trying to figure out here is how are others interpreting the documentation that we currently have for the Zcash protocol? Like, how are people seeing what we have currently? How are people interpreting it? And what are your assumptions about how it will develop and change? And then what kinds of documentation, like including things that we're missing, like we don't have a good / any documentation of the network protocol right now. Would you expect to see that in a zip format? Would you expect to see that as a new kind of protocol spec? And then if we're going to end up with sort of more of these kinds of living documents, should we be establishing them and building them in a different way from the way in which we currently try and build and propose zips?
I mean, if we are going to have living spec documents that are like the protocol spec in some way, then I would want to split out some of the stuff that is already in the protocol spec, because that document is too unwieldy. So carry on.
This is the open floor point where
Right.
chime in.
Yeah, I mean, there were, additional context. I mean, there were a number of zips kind of where this applied, right? Dara mentioned zip 212.
Yeah, the number of zips that are nominally in NU5 has at least doubled, if not more,
Right.
as we've made the decision to turn previous zips into living documents.
Right. Yeah, like zip 209, right, which is preventing shielded pool balances from going negative.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, right. Yeah. So.
And it's like, a lot of those changes, you could just say, that's all zip 224. It should just be, that's it. Part of the change we're making is adding the orchard pool. But does it make sense? And is that the right place for people when they come to actually implement it? And from this perspective, I think the Zebra devs actually probably have the best perspective on how they've been trying to parse the protocol out of the specs that we have.
Yeah, so I agree very much with Dara that the protocol spec is very large. Sorry, speaking as the person who has opened an awful lot of tickets on the spec, it'd also be good to get Deirdre's perspective on this, on the cryptography in the spec. So I guess either what we need is an easier way to reference large blocks of consensus rules in the spec, or we need the spec split into smaller documents, or maybe both. But definitely it would be great to get a way to reference things down to say the shielded pool level of transaction rules, rather than going, here are the 3 pages of transaction consensus rules. Please try and find a similar rule that we might have quoted in code that is now a bit out of date, and update the rule and update the code. That is a process that's going to become more difficult for us as we have to update our implementation. So yeah, I guess that would be one observation.
There will be ways to link to specific consensus rules. I've been planning that for a while, and just haven't got around to it. But that's entirely doable. There's a prototype implementation of it.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, but even then, but
that doesn't give you the organization of rules that you just asked for, because it would
it doesn't. Definitely. Particularly, I think as we look towards deprecating Sprout, it will be very useful to have split up the transaction consensus rules into sections, like we've split up the shielded pools into sections earlier in the spec. So that would be very helpful.
So one possible organization is just to have it by, so it's already color coded by the network upgrade in which a particular rule was introduced. Do you just want me to sort it by that color coding effectively?
That would be particularly helpful, but when we went to implement Sprout validation, what we really needed was all of the Sprout rules in one place, particularly so that we knew that we, for example, wouldn't have to do anything to create new Sprout outputs, because that functionality had been disabled. So that although that consensus rule came in at Canopy, it would have been easier for us if it was in a Sprout section.
And actually, that's interesting, because that's not actually the rule that came in. The rule that came in...
Yes. Sorry, it is not exactly the rule that came in. So again, having all these rules in the same place would help with being very specific. Sorry, the actual rule that came in, just to clarify, is that it's not possible to add any new value to the pool.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is you're proving your point exactly, which is the and to Dara's point of color coding by network upgrade, that's very useful when we're looking at new rules bringing in within the protocol. It's less useful for deprecating rules, because we might, for example, be introducing rules to do with a pool over several network upgrades, but want to turn them off as a unit, or turn off parts of something that was brought in one network upgrade within another one.
So if a rule has a limited lifetime, in other words, it's no longer applicable after a network upgrade, that is also color coded. So it will say something like a sapling onward before Canopy.
Yeah.
Right. Nate,
Yeah,
you had a hand up. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, I'm distant, like I'm not implementing consensus nodes, and I'm not carefully reviewing new changes to the spec, although I should be. But it seems natural to me that I would want to see the rules indexed by sort of activation range, or like this, this is the set of NU5 rules, and that might be redundant with NU4 rules, and then that might cross-link. But if I want to just know what are the rules for NU5, I feel like I would want to go to one section that says that and only that. But I don't know, does that sound...
problem? Yeah, we're running into the problem that the spec is a linear document, and there are multiple ways to index rules.
Right, and won't we run out of colors if each, like, because rule, like any given upgrade...
because I collapsed several colors.
Okay.
The answer is we already ran out of colors.
Yeah, I finessed it. So the detail is that we used to distinguish. There used to be versions of the spec for overwinter. Hang on, is this right? There used to be a specific Sprout version of the spec.
Yeah, and there was also
that
changes
showed
from
the
Zcash
changes
as
from
well.
Zcash. So all of those changes from Zcash, that color coding has been dropped. It's not really necessary anymore.
Chris?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
I think that one of the points of tension with respect to whether zips are living documents is that in most cases, with some exceptions, so the content of the zips is not reproduced in a sort of specification form, right? Or the content is not duplicated into the specification, except for when it is, like, zip 225, the contents is.
So it is for consensus rules. So the exceptions to that are things like zip 143, 243, 244, which are part of consensus because they're defining Zcash.
But I mean, I'm also speaking about things like zip 32, right? Things that are explicitly not consensus. They're just about wallet behavior, but that is the only specification of that wallet behavior. And I guess the option that I'm suggesting is that that we could take the approach of zips are explicitly improvement proposals, the request for change, but that, we could split up the protocol specification itself to a degree, but B, other things that have been proposed in the form of zips result in another piece of specification that is sort of independent and the consequence of that zip. And then I don't know how we refer to those things, but we might no longer refer to things as, zip 32. We might instead refer to, the actual specification that is the outcome of zip 32.
This is part of sort of the...
Does this actually help? Because it creates two documents, one of which is inherently out of date.
Yes, but the point is that that the zip is either that if it's active, that its contents have been faithfully represented and may have been updated, but you should really go look at the specification that arose from that zip.
I'm not sure whether that would produce the most useful form of documents, because in the case of the update to zip 32, for example, it's basically adding new sections for Orchard. So it's not as though we're changing the stuff that's already there. It's just so that you can find it in one place.
That's true, but if we look at the changes, for example, to the signature hashes, we have 3 zips that have specified signature hashes over time, and some of them have specified changes to the previous signature hash.
I mean, I think arguably Zcashing should always have been in the protocol spec, and it arguably was a mistake for it to be in a zip in the first place. But it's just my opinion.
But you can also look at the SIG hashes, because yes, we haven't actually made a change to the SIG hash format. Each of those SIG hashes applies to a specific version of transaction. We just happen to have rotated the transaction version every time until NU5. Some of them refer to earlier versions of SIG hashing for some, indirectly for some of their components, but they're all independent upgrades to the protocol, in a sense. I don't know if it was Taylor or Nat first. So
Taylor was next.
So I have a question that might help us narrow the scope of the discussion. Probably in a week or two, the Zebra team is going to shift to focusing on building a mempool. And so we're going to be asking a lot of questions about how mempools should work, or probably more, given our timelines, what is the minimum we need to do to have an effective, useful mempool? And we'd really like to know how we're going to spec that out or write that down. I think a zip would be fine, personally. I also think a separate spec document would be fine. Zips are perhaps a little more accessible to being edited. We don't really mind, but I don't know if it belongs in the specification as a consensus rule or not.
That raises an important point, which is that the protocol specification is difficult to edit. And unfortunately, I have let it become a mess of macros that I understand, which is unfortunate. So maybe it can be made more accessible, or we can avoid any sort of split out documents from the spec or any new living specifications having that macro complexity.
Nate?
Yeah, I have a proposal of a simplification proposal. So if you are interested in implementing anything for Zcash that's standardized, or if you just want to know how it works, then you can look at a set of specifications. If you want to propose or discuss or consider ways to change that, those would be zips. And then I guess we would need a third piece, because we have a lot of missing specifications, such as maybe around mempool behaviors. We aggressively document and also draft notes for missing areas of specification. And maybe we want different formats, right? Like maybe we want a markdown book format for the networking spec that could be decoupled from some of the cryptography spec. It's just a proposal. But when I'm wanting to understand how things work, it feels best to me to have, if I feel like I need to look at specs and then look at some zips and understand their relationship and chronology, it makes it really difficult to understand what's the full state of the system.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, so this proposal would also mean specifications are much broader than just consensus. It would be anything implementers or ecosystem want to standardize.
So
I
if
mean,
we're
they
doing
always have
that,
in theory.
Yeah, if we're doing that, we're effectively signing up to the busy work and duplication of taking things that are proposed and merging them in or defining new and bring them across to be specs. But because that's something that concerned me about turning existing zips into living documents, was that someone who's approaching it, when we do those changes, we're only making changes to the specification part of the zip. The existing, the motivation, the rationale, all that all stems from the original proposal. That may not make sense for the change that we're making to the living document.
I have tried to avoid that problem in the documents that I've updated. So they will try to make clear what is historical motivation and what is a later change. So I'm still not clear on what problem we're trying to solve, because so the protocol is defined by the protocol specification. The protocol specification refers to zips, and if those zips were fixed sort of descriptions of changes to be made in a point in time, then you would basically have to copy the specification into the spec. As it is, it's more modular because the spec doesn't have to include everything. It doesn't have to include, for example, Zcashing. So there's a trade-off here between keeping stuff. What am I trying to say here? I'm still not clear on what problem we're trying to solve, because if you know, for example, that say hierarchical derivation of addresses is defined in zip32, you just want to be able to remember that and then go to zip32, and then it will tell you everything you need to know about that subject.
But where do you learn that?
That's what I've been trying to. Well,
where
I mean,
do you
in the
learn
case of
zip30?
you either learn it by going to the protocol specification as a starting point, and then it will tell you that that's defined in zip32, or you just ask someone and they say that's where it's defined.
Or you just go to Zcash and see if something meaningful is in the title. Yeah.
But no, that last approach definitely doesn't work, because
it doesn't scale.
Zips, yeah, because there's going to be many zips that are outdated or not even active yet. They're proposals, and just scanning through like which ones supersede which other ones. It's
well, they all have a status, so that they will say whether they're active or proposal or withdrawn.
Okay. To what degree, Dara, is your complaint here just about the fact that the protocol specification is a single PDF document and not a hyperlinked book that
that would certainly help. But on the other hand, if we split it out, I'm signing myself up for a ton of work to do that.
No, I understand that challenge.
Yeah.
So Strad, your hand was up next. Seth.
Yeah. So I had a thought. So one of the things we mentioned before was like, if we did have zips define the improvement, the change, and then we have to go and update the spec to do the rationale. And then someone else said, well, they were basically talking about PRs. So what if we did a hybrid of both? So the zips don't actually contain the specification. When someone comes along with a zip, the zip contains everything it currently contains except for the specification section. And the specification is just done as a patch on the relevant specification document.
Cool.
So hang on though, this is not going to work for draft specifications, because it's a consensus change, so you're updating the protocol spec, and you would have to have two different versions of the protocol spec. And then what if you decide not to do the zip?
Right. So the question then becomes, how do you manage those patches on the specifications prior to them getting merged down. And this also comes into the usability of updating them, because right now we couldn't do that on the protocol.pdf document. Well, we sort of can, because you do have the ability to define. We have.
We had an NU5.pdf, which is which was the proposed NU5 changes.
Yes, but we get back to the point of like, it's not an accessible way to do it for those, versus Markdown documents are accessible in that sense, but they don't have the flexibility of that kind of changes. But assuming we could figure out a way to implement it, would that be a workflow that might be appealing to people, and one that they could understand how to contribute changes with?
Nate.
But before I answer that, aren't we just getting closer and closer to reifying GitHub? Because like Dara brought up, what if you want like a proposed change to the protocol, and we want to like talk about that and review it? To me, that sounds like a branch. What if we want to propose changes to a spec and we want to separate out sort of the motivation and discussion of that change versus the change itself? It's like a PR, right? So is it
right?
But
people have explicitly said that they don't want to use GitHub for this. But okay,
but a bespoke system with Markdown plus PDF LaTeX, it doesn't feel like it makes it more accessible to me at this point.
Dodger, to the WHO, we had plenty of these problems when we were looking at the dev fund process and all those zips. A lot of the lead up to that in the early stages, and even zips prior to that, we had a lot of feedback from people who that's why a lot of that development of those zips end up actually happening on the forum. And then we had a few people who manually migrated those into proposals in GitHub. But there was definitely a split there.
It was basically me and Mr. FPGA moving stuff to GitHub.
So maybe there isn't a tool that is good for both coders and non-coders to use. So we shouldn't put both coding and non-coding into zips.
But here, if we're talking about a protocol spec, I think we're talking about a different audience and a different set of people who want to be involved than the sort of people who wanted to be involved in the dev fund.
Yeah.
That's a fair point.
Yeah, don't do dev funds and protocol specs with the same tools.
And also
because they're not for the same people.
Yeah, and also if we have this particular split, then if you think of what is the specification, that's actually very interesting. If we think about what a zip would be in this format, it would be everything except the spec. So it would be the motivation, the rationale, the desire, the impetus for it happening, and like enough of a broad strokes in terms of what they want to achieve. It's the client's sketch of what they want the artist to do, and then the artist goes and actually turns it into something.
Hang on though, you can't review a proposal without a spec. So you would still have to review everything. You still have to read the motivation and the spec together.
Yes, but as far as for people like who are doing dev fund stuff, that doesn't require a spec at that stage. You see what I'm getting at? So like,
I think the dev fund was kind of a special case.
I could imagine things like the change to fees.
There could be similar cases, yeah.
The change to fees, the actual spec for that is very simple, but the motivation for it is really what takes up the page count. And it's the thing that you need to get like actually doing the cycling around to people on in forums that may not be GitHub.
I'm worried that we would actually be making things worse by separating specification from motivation.
Hey, Tayor, let's get you in there while your hand's up.
Yeah, so maybe we can't solve all of this all at once, but we need to do something for the mempool documentation in the next month or so. We're willing to try a few things, but we don't want to put a lot of work into changing formats once we've started, because we'll be really focused on the implementation and design. So can I propose that we make a separate specification for the mempool in starting with Markdown, because I think that'll be easier for most of our developers to edit and patch. And because we will be doing a lot of editing and patching as we do testing and things like that. And I don't mind where it goes or what it looks like or what it's called. I just need it to be easy for us to work with.
Do you prefer Markdown
sorry, yeah,
to
go for it.
RST? Because the current zips are in RST.
Yes, given what we're used to in our team, I think we would prefer Markdown, but I also don't think the difference matters that much.
It doesn't. You can, in principle, write zips in Markdown already. All of the makefiles support for that is there. It's just that none of them are at the moment.
Right. Well, happy to maybe trial that as well. But yeah, I just think that would be really useful for us in the next month or so. We can see how it goes. Once we're past sort of the implementation and testing phase of that, we can come back and have another discussion, say, okay, we trialed this, how do we think it went? What do we want to do for NU6, which is a much bigger scope in many ways.
Yeah, the mempool is as far as the potential things that we need to specify, is a pretty small and targeted change. Definitely smaller than the network protocol. So yeah, I'm supportive of getting a Markdown document started and then seeing how it evolves in terms of the context of keeping all this stuff we've discussed in mind.
So I mean, we've also
formally, would this be a zip or would it be a different kind of document?
So if it was a zip, well, it's not really an improvement, but if it was a zip, I think
don't get hung up on zip standing for improvement.
I would happily formally make it a zip defining the sort of minimal mempool behavior that is acceptable. I don't necessarily think I'd want to document everything.
More like an RFC.
Yeah. But I don't mind if the Zcashd team wants to document everything. That would be amazingly helpful to us. We're just not going to commit to everything you document, and we probably need to be clear about the difference.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like Dodger. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. I just wanted to challenge the idea that the specification should not be separated from the motivation. Because I think in our situation where we're building, we're looking to build against the specification. To a certain extent, we don't really care about the motivation. We just want to, what do we need to build? What are the network messages? How does the gospel protocol work? Whatever. Why it's that way is, of course, abstractly interesting, but it doesn't have a direct bearing on how we're going about building Zebra. I just wanted to make that point.
I think that I mean, personally, when I'm reading a spec, I always want to read the motivation, because it's like a consistency check. If I see something that doesn't match up with the motivation, then I'm going to want to ask why that is. And maybe it's that there's actually an error in the specification.
I would say
so I would always want to read.
It depends on whether you're reading the specification for the first or the third or diving into a specific point for reference. Does it not?
You can just skip to the specification section if that's what you're doing.
Okay.
So Chris, your hand was up next. If you just
I also just wanted to, with respect to Markdown, I don't know how closely it relates, but we certainly on the core team right now are using Markdown quite heavily for stuff that is at the very least specification adjacent. We use HackMD to do sketches, and then some of that content gets moved into the Halo book or the Orchard book or something of that sort. So I feel like that's not a significant leap to start using, hyperlinked markdown books for specification adjacent purposes.
No, it's
Good
not.
point.
I agree.
Nate, you were next.
Yeah, so similar tangent, but less about the format, more about the content. To me, it feels like it could be helpful. I could be wrong, but it could be helpful to have something that is not a spec because it's loose and may contain, it may be incorrect and it may not be specific enough, but it's sort of a working document of notes around the design of things we've noticed but aren't yet well specified. Maybe it's like a spec wish list, but I'm imagining like, hey, we noticed the mempool on Zcashd seems to do this, and we're not saying that that should be standardized or specified, but we want to consider that when we're developing a spec for the mempool. Is there any need for that, or is that?
I think that's what the Zcash zip GitHub is for. Just
Okay.
open
Issue tracker?
an issue on the GitHub. Yeah.
Okay.
Strad?
I just wanted to raise, so to Dara's point about reading the spec and design notes beside it, we already have precedent for splitting those two for Orchard, where we have the Orchard book where, well, we have the protocol spec where we've made changes to add this is what the Orchard spec is. And then we have the Orchard book, which provides the design rationale, most of which is just, we're doing the same thing as Sapling with minor modifications. So the pages are pretty empty, but the nullify page in particular is some very heavy motivation rationale, almost like if we were to have written a zip specifically on introducing a new way to do nullifiers compared to what we did for Sprout or Sapling, that would pretty much everything on that Orchard book page would have been in that zip, along with the couple of lines that are happen to be in that one, but that are really in the canonical in the spec, which specify the nullifier. So we do have some precedent for that, and I would argue that maybe we don't do this for existing stuff because busy work. But I think we can deal with having both of them and access to both of them with effective cross-linking. So I would expect, for example, the zips to always have a link, ideally a permanent a consistent hard anchor to the points in the spec that if we do a patch to a specification to include some changes, that if you happen to find the zip first, you are able to from there navigate to the bits of the spec that are relevant. And ideally, the spec can then keep links back to the zip for here's why we did it this way, if you care.
We've already been doing that.
Right.
To some extent.
All right, Tayor?
Yeah, I have another suggestion that I think would be helpful for people who are coming to using zips.zcash. If we could separate out the active zips from the historical zips that were used but are no longer active in the current network upgrade, and then the zips that were never activated, that would make it much easier to find out what the current behavior is, and then find out what needs to be validated for previous blocks but can't be actively done anymore. And the statuses aren't quite the same as that because they're all in the same table. So it's a bit harder to navigate.
Would a checkbox that sort of says don't show historical zips, would that be sufficient?
Yeah, sure. That would also be
I can implement that.
Yeah. So maybe I don't show historical zips and don't show zips that were never ever used at all.
So it's currently it shows those as crossed out. But
right. Okay. Well,
the
that's
ones
fine.
that were withdrawn and the ones that are obsolete. Yeah.
Some kind of visual indicator would also be fine.
Yeah, there may be, and I see Dodger your hand up next. Just quickly to respond to that. I mean, I can't imagine it would be that difficult to import some kind of state off the current zips and provide kind of a little, for lack of a better term, filter at the top of the page where you kind of search on what you want, see everything, see only, unpublished zips or whatever the search criteria, zips this year, whatever. I have no idea, but I would think that might be a pretty easy option to implement.
I mean, if someone wants to open a PR to change the HTML for the index page, that would be great, because then I wouldn't have to do with it.
Right.
Have to do it and could spend more of my time on Orchard.
Right. Okay. All right. Dodger.
It's a minor tangent, but I was just thinking when we were talking about the mempool and spec and so on, one thing, and this is more for Tior to be aware of, one thing that we should bear in mind is that there are various things that have been implemented in the Zcashd mempool around preventing sort of denial of service stuff, that may be worth looking at, and that a lot of thought went into them at the time, and
right,
sort of rules
Absolutely.
for dropping stuff, and rules for managing the size of the mempool and so on. So that's something
Right.
that we should probably
that's already
be documented.
That's already defined in the zip, so I'd imagine the new zip would just refer to that.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I didn't realize.
Yeah, so that's actually an example of like, that was a change we made to Zcashd, but we stuck it in as if for like, here's a change we've made to the behavior of Zcash, if not necessarily the consensus protocol. But again, it defines a change we made. It's not really the mempool spec though. It's just a delta on the inherent mempool spec, which is the undocumented behavior we inherited from Bitcoin.
Yeah,
So
which
for-
Bitcoin
so
still
for-
hasn't documented.
Exactly.
Yes, I am very aware of that, but I'm also very aware of just how much time implementing those kind of security fixes can take.
Yeah.
And so for our first version, we may want to have very, very strict limits, and then move towards perhaps more complex ways of doing things. So for example, while we're testing and things could still go terribly wrong, we might put a hard cap of 5 or 10 transactions on it, just so nothing can happen that's really very bad.
And that kind of
then we
thing's-
can relax towards a more complex implementation.
And that kind of thing should be fine as long as Zebra is a minority of the network, so transactions still propagate fine. I'm
In
going
the
to
time
just
frame we're talking about, that should be almost a given, unless people get really enthusiastic about it.
I'm going to interject here because we are either 2 minutes or 12 minutes from time. I think we're technically 2 minutes on the schedule. So just to quickly summarize up actions, like action points as I understand them. So Zebra team are planning on mempool stuff coming up soon, and so you're going to be writing a document that describes the minimum set of interoperable mempool behavior as you see them, and then we'll obviously like collaborate and discuss with you in terms of elucidating that behavior. But you'll be writing that and doing so in a markdown sense that can exist in either a zip or a markdown book or whatever. So that's happening. We talked about improving the usability of the zips.zcash page just before. We talked about hard linking in terms of making sure that we can easily reference particular consensus rules related to shielded pools and adding the ability to do that. And then we generally discussed potentially changing the way in which we write, not necessarily changing the old zips and things, but potentially change the way we write new zips. And so we will keep the mempool one that's being worked on in mind as a test case for, okay, how about if we have a document that is written from the start as a living spec alongside the protocol spec, and then see how the environment feels. Because we actually, as has just been pointed out, have a zip that is an update to the mempool document, so we can see how we can integrate that zip with this mempool document and sort of see that interaction on a small scale before we need to make further changes. Is there anything else that I missed from that in terms of concrete things that might be happening soon? This was mostly for my benefit, so I can check the recording later and only have a single bit to look at.
I think that's a pretty good summary. Yeah.
Cool. Not hearing any complaints?
No, I don't think anything was obviously dropped. So, yeah, caveat. So I've got a hand up. Just kind of wrap us up a little bit. But thanks, Starad, for suggesting that topic. Number one, I mean, it became, I guess, more apparent for me personally within U5 that this was something to talk about and think about and see if we can improve on, just because of the nature of NU5 being so, so large and all encompassing in terms of what the kind of I hate to call them the core zips, but kind of the main additional zips that we were adding. And then that also had some implications for past zips that we'd already implemented that needed to be updated or at least reflect some of the changes. So I think it's really good. I think it's just kind of an evolution of what we're doing with additional teams and, an evolution of the protocol in general. So the other thing I just wanted to add, I should have brought this up when we were talking about NU5, but it's not necessarily just NU5 specific. Kind of had some a limited little conversation with Dodger this week about kind of work-life balance and the team on our side. So this is just general encouragement. It has nothing to do with protocol specific development, but the teams have been running, I mentioned redlining earlier, for quite a while. And that's only sustainable for so long. Number one, from a personal level or a burnout level. But number two, like our main motivation with NU5 or any, and I'm not speaking for when I say we, I mean, I hope I'm talking for other like-minded folks in the Zcash project. Our goal is not to hit a specific date, but to deliver, a high quality, safe, secure upgrade. And we do our best work when we're rested and not burned out and not redlining constantly. So I've been, if it looks like, I mean, we honestly got incredibly lucky with Kedit coming up saying, hey, could we move things by a couple of weeks? We're like, oh, sure, no problem on our side. But anyway, I just want to let everyone know, for the benefit of those that might see the recording later, we've definitely talked about this at NCC or ECC, sorry. Too many CCs and acronyms these days. But work-life balance is important, and we want to protect, the well-being of the team members. So I'm encouraging them to, obviously not work all weekend long, and in the middle of the week, just press pause if you need to, and catch your breath. I think we do our best work when we're all invested in, as Dodger points, invested in the team. But we do our best work when we're fresh and at our sharpest. So anyway, Nate, I see your hand popped up there as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, usually when I'm working too much, it's because I feel like I need to finish something on a particular time. And I was wondering, if people need more rest, do we need to shift the schedule? And then when I was thinking about that, I was wondering, what are the really hard constraints? So I know that security audits are kind of a hard constraint because ECC is on the hook to pay according to a specific schedule.
Right.
Do we need to adjust anything or to make space for relaxing or
so
not?
I think for future upgrades, there are some lessons to learn about not being too optimistic and sort of estimating the schedule when setting the dates of security audits. But we need to be absolutely confident that stuff will be implemented by the time it's needed for an audit.
Yeah, I think that was a mistake this time, being too aggressive with the audit schedule and not planning for the kinds of delays we had. So
right,
it's definitely something.
And it's so Nate, to answer your question, I mean the biggest, you hit on it, like the biggest, hard time crunch forcing factor we have is getting, especially code ready for the implementation audit phase, because you line those up, honestly months in advance to make sure you can secure the firms that you really want to use, and to NCC and Kedit's credit, they're incredibly great partners, like very easy to work with. And I'm yet to make a request or ask them about something that they haven't been wholeheartedly, you know, positive and supportive on. So great partners, but you kind of line them up generally, you know, a couple months in advance at least. And then you're kind of working against, okay, they're slotting in X number of days in a certain window, and you're working, you know, pretty hard to make sure you've got something largely finished to deliver them for that evaluation. So that is one of the things. Outside of that, a large part of it is just, you know, quite honestly, like managing community expectations of when we might activate on testnet or mainnet. One of the things Deirdre and I pointed out in our presentation on reworking the NUP at ZCon 2 was, hey, let's get away from, you know, picking an activation date 9 months in advance. Let's just have like a target window, and we think it'll land in there somewhere, and we'll keep you updated as we progress. It seems a much more sane way to try to do it, especially with something as large as NU5. So that's kind of my 2 cents anyway. All right. Will anyone have anything else? I think we're a few minutes over time, but not too bad. So. All right. Well, look, everyone have a good weekend, and actually enjoy the weekend. Like, enjoy, do something fun, and we'll catch up in Discord and catch up next week. So.
I'm seeing a performance of Midsummer Night's Dream, so that'll be fun.
Oh, nice. That'll be nice.
Yeah.
All right. Very good.
It's an outdoor performance, so I'm looking
right.
forward to it.
Very good.
See you.
All right, everyone, have a good weekend.
Bye all.
Bye.
Cheerio.